Hi, everybody. Yeah.
Well, let me introduce you. I'll just introduce the session. We're working today, session 2, with Temple Theology by Margaret Barker. And I'm going to turn this over to John Goldsmith, who has a few words to help us through this introductory session.
Thank you, Alice, and hi, everybody. I hope that I'll be a little less of a gibberer than I was last time, but let's see anyhow. At the end of last session, Alice said she had a special question for me. How does the first temple tradition describe itself? And it shows how doolally I was last time, in that I didn't immediately answer. And I can't answer that question because the first temple tradition has, to a great extent, been lost. Remember, after Josiah had his Reformation, or whatever you call it, the people in control were the Second Temple people, the Deuteronomists. And so most of what is in our current Bible has been either written or at least deeply influenced by the Second Temple rather than the First Temple. So I can't simply say, yes, this book will show you absolutely everything. We have to sort of read between the lines, which is what history is all about anyhow. I think probably the best, as it were, very brief summary is to be found in Margaret's book in the foreword on the first page. And in this foreword, MacDade quotes Margaret, "Temple theology is the original context of the New Testament. It knew of incarnation and atonement, the sons of God and the life of the age to come, the day of judgment, justification, salvation, the renewed covenant, and the kingdom of God." I think that is a wonderful collection of important issues. And so if you want to have an idea of what Margaret is working on, that little list there on the first page of the foreword in the book we're looking at will be really helpful. Now, we are able to read between the lines because some of the lines, as it were, of the old tradition have been preserved. And the first bit that I'd like to look at is the patriarchal religion. You all know the stories of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and Joseph. And whenever we see them, they are always sacrificing all over the place, not only in Jerusalem, that they build sacred pillars by which they worship, and also how they love groves of trees in which they worship. They do that all over the place. But these were things that Josiah absolutely forbade. So that makes you think, was Josiah really reforming, or was he actually changing things quite a bit? After all, the patriarchs, what was good enough for the patriarchs, you'd have thought was, good enough, should have been good enough for Josiah. But no, not so. These were things he wanted to get rid of. You shall sacrifice in Jerusalem only. You shall not go up to every green tree on every high hill and worship God there. No, that is not right. And if you have these high pillars in your places of worship, tear them down. So clearly you've got two traditions going on here. There's the patriarchal tradition and the Deuteronomic tradition. And it is very reasonable to say perhaps the patriarchal traditions are just as old, excuse me, if not older, than Josiah and his reforms. So that is a very interesting thing, I think, in the patriarchal religion. Secondly, there is that book, 1 Enoch. 1 Enoch used to be in, I think, the Bible of most of churches. You find it in the New Testament. It is quoted in the letter of Jude. So clearly it was regarded in the early Christian days as quite an important book. After all, Jude wouldn't have quoted him fairly extensively if he hadn't thought that. And in the Dead Sea Scrolls, there are fragments of it in Aramaic in manuscripts that are certainly pre-Christian. So clearly 1 Enoch is a pre-Christian text, and it was regarded as a sacred text by early Christians. So that means it's quite fun. As I say, it is only survives in Coptic in the scriptures of the Ethiopic Church. Perhaps I didn't say that. Yes, it was in the Ethiopic Orthodox Church. And I just want us to look at one tiny fragment of 1 Enoch, which is known as the Apocalypse of Weeks. This is a very brief summary of it. The first temple is built. The temple authorities fall into blindness. A man, quite likely Isaiah, ascends to God, and the first temple is burned. Just note there that the temple authorities fall into blindness before the temple is burned. In other words, I think the Apocalypse of Weeks in 1 Enoch is saying Josiah's reforms were actually the blindness which messed everything up. The Babylons 50 years or whatever it was, 30 or 40 or 50 years later, did come and destroy Jerusalem and burn the temple. But actually the disaster had occurred before in Josiah's reforms, in the eyes of the author of the Apocalypse of Weeks. And then there is the rise of the wicked generation. Now this is interesting. The wicked generation is rising during the interval between the destruction of the first temple and the establishing of the second temple. So 1 Enoch is saying, don't look to your current temple or your current plans for the temple, because the people who are in charge there have got it wrong. In other words, they're probably followers of Josiah's reforms. The election of the chosen righteous then arises from the eternal plant of righteousness. I think that's his way of saying, but it's not all bad news. The folk in Jerusalem may have gone off the rails, but there is a new generation somewhere else, probably in Arabia. And when we talk about Arabia in these circumstances, we're not talking sort of Mecca and Saudi Arabia. We're really talking about sort of the desert to the north of Syria, on the fringes there. So we have got the...
Can I ask you a question, John? Is this Enoch, is that Enoch speaking?
Well, I mean, who knows with an ancient book? I mean, I would be surprised. Enoch is, I mean, the Deuteronomists were saying Moses is the only person you need to bother about. 1 Enoch says, no, you've got to think of, well, not only many more things, people than Moses. I don't think Moses is mentioned, but in 1 Enoch, Enoch is one of the patriarchs, you know, in his own right, someone to whom God has entrusted mysteries. And Noah is very important because, as you know, when Noah comes and the animals come out of the ark, there is a new covenant established. And that is the, you know, covenant of peace, in which God puts the rainbow in the sky and saying, from now on, I am not going to lose patience and smash everything to bits. From now on, I am going to be with you all the time. And that was a very, very important part of the First Temple tradition. Then, not only have we got this, these goodies, as it were, arising, there's a verse that says, you know, talks about judgment on oppression and sinners, and then the righteous exercise its judgment, and they then prosper. And then the temple of the great King, built in glory forever, that is looking to the future, because the only temple that was built afterwards is the second temple in Jerusalem, which was in the hands of the baddies, as it were, the Josianic folk. But they were looking forward to the time when the real temple would be rebuilt. And of course, and this is important, the people of the first temple who survived, who kept these traditions going, were quite happy to have temples in more than one place. It was only Josiah and Deuteronomy who wanted it to be in Jerusalem only, thank you very much. There were a lot of Jews in Egypt, because a lot of Jews had come and gone in Egypt. And there were a couple of Jewish temples in Egypt, Jewish temples. And we have got some interesting Aramaic papyri which have been preserved in Egypt. And one is a letter from, I think, the Jewish temple on the island in the middle of the Nile in Elephantine, when they were asking the high priests if they wouldn't mind helping them out with a tricky calendrical question. When is the day this festival should fall? So they were at least on speaking terms together. And there's another interesting letter from another group of Jewish people, or it might have been the same ones at Elephantine. And they had had a temple for some time. And to start off with, all they had done was sacrifice fruit and vegetables. And that was very acceptable to the local Egyptians. But then they thought they would copy the Jerusalem temple and start slaughtering animals. And I think you can all imagine how sacred the Egyptians found animals. And they weren't going to have this wretched group of upstarts sort of, you know, killing these potentially sacred animals. And so I think they did sort things out. And the then Pharaoh said, yes, build your temple again, but for heaven's sake, this time, just stick to fruit and vegetable sacrifices, which you did before. So I just mentioned this, not that it's really got anything substantial to say to us, but it does show that the traditions we have got tend to make life just a little bit too easy. It wasn't straightforward, all the Jews believing the one thing. There were lots and lots of different sort of Jews doing different things, and among whom were very prominent were these first temple survivors. And the Dead Sea Scrolls that we have been talking about, among whom a lot of the existing tradition of the first temple is found there. They saw themselves as temple people, but my word, They did not go to Jerusalem. No, the temple in Jerusalem has got it wrong. It is no longer God's temple. We are God's temple. We can't do anything official yet, but we are waiting for God to re-establish us. Right.
John, may I add something here? I can't help but make patterns, see patterns. And of course, you know, just things that repeat themselves, not necessarily just in the sense of a religious movements, but in terms of our own, you know, movements of government's power, all these things. What I see, the theme I see, is that there's an established order. Whenever there's an established order, political, religious, whatever it is, it sets up shop. And at first it's decentralized because it's relying on its taproot is, for instance, the United States is this way. It was based on a union of a bunch of states, decentralized. And then you have this central government that sets up shop. And then there's always this tension between a centralized authority and its decentralized, where you might say the grassroots or the taproot of a movement started that's trying to hold on to the heart and soul of it. And then this, I look at it as that there's a degeneracy or a sort of a sclerosis, you know, some sort of crystallization that creeps in and actually causes such a degeneration and such a decrepitude in the centralized format that it begins to just become you know, corrupt and evil. And you have to pull away from it, disassociate from it, or it has to go ahead and be allowed to destroy itself, because that's the only way forward. So I'm just seeing correlations to what's going on today too, all over the world, with movement. And I think the movement of trying to find, maybe it's quixotic, but trying to find that ethereal temple of the heart and try to build it. We're still trying to do that ever since Christ came on the scene.
Yes. I think the only thing I'd want to sort of argue a bit with you is that, yes, a centralized authority very often makes people judge things according to what they are saying and not what God is saying, you know, to everybody. But also, I think the people who are wanting to breathe new life into a decrepit temple situation, they are often just as dyed in the wool as the existing authorities. And I think that all of us, whether we are dyed in the wool conservatives or ultra new, you know, radicals, we have to make sure that we are very careful not to put our own tradition before what God is saying to us, because I think all of us are terribly good at actually creating God in our image. And of course, we did not create God in our image. God created us, and that is where we actually need to say, okay, you may be a bit different, but perhaps you've got something important to say there. Perhaps you are hanging on to a bit of truth that we need to hang on to. Perhaps you are actually pointing to a change that God is desperately wanting us to do. Just being old or new is not enough. It's interesting, Jesus, I think to say he had a foot in both camps is probably wrong, but he was certainly on speaking terms with both and entered into deep discussions with them. I mean, Nicodemus was clearly a representative of the old regime, the Deuteronomic, second temple regime. And while Jesus certainly had a lot to argue about with him or to discuss with him, he didn't write him off. So anyhow, that's just Goldsmith waffling on. And now some very brief things. Margaret points out in what we've been reading that it is very difficult to find key Deuteronomic themes, i.e. Moses and the Ten Commandments. Those are the big things that Josiah and company were saying, this is the only thing that matters. It is very difficult to find these key Deuteronomic themes in the early part of the book of Isaiah. In other words, the bits where the prophet Isaiah from Jerusalem, which he actually did write, which is interesting. The Old Testament as we have it, Moses is certainly a very important figure in the Old Testament, possibly the most important figure in the Old Testament. But I think for Isaiah, Moses pretty clearly wasn't quite as important as we are used to saying it. So that is just worthwhile bearing in mind. And then in the later chapters of Isaiah, which will have been written by the followers of Isaiah, of the first Isaiah, after he had died, they were complaining that the ancient worshippers of Yahweh had been excluded from the temple in Jerusalem. Look, they were complaining. These exiles from Babylon, they come back with their hats full of coins from the king of Persia, and they've built the temple and they are arranging it according to how they and they alone really see things. And we who've hung on in the homeland and we have been loyal to the temple have been excluded. And not unnaturally, they are fairly pissed off about that. And so that is quite an interesting thing to be aware of. Another thing that's worthwhile just us being aware of is that in the New Testament, the last book is the book of Revelation. And we find this a very, very difficult book because there's so many weird images going on. But actually, if you look at this imagery, you'll find most of it is First Temple imagery. There's this lovely picture of the temple, and you can see into the temple to the Holy of Holies. And the Holy of Holies is not temple, it's not empty, which is what it should have been according to Deuteronomy. There is the golden throne in the center of the Holy of Holies. And the golden cherubim are the sort of the armrests, as it were, of this fantastic golden throne, and various other things. The menorah, the great 7-branch candlestick. Do you remember the candlestick with 7 branches that crops up in the Revelation? There's all this wonderful temple imagery, which has nothing to do with the second temple imagery, but it has got to do with the imagery in the first temple. But I think, as Alison reminded us quite well, there's gains and there's losses. I mean, I love the imagery of the first temple, the golden throne where God and the king sit and are worshipped. I love the cherubim on either side of the throne, and the 7-branch candlestick, and all the other sort of things. But there is also something rather special about the idea of an empty Holy of Holies, because nothing is big enough to represent God. You can imagine these Roman generals. I mean, Pompey was one of them, and Titus, the one who destroyed the temple in the end, and Jerusalem. And before the flames got hold, they thought, let's go into the Holy of Holies and see what they really get up to, because there are all sorts of stupid ideas, what was going on. Whenever you have something secret, people are always going to think the worst possible. And they went in and there was nothing. I think that might have just given them a little, I wonder what this is saying. So the Deuteronomic and Josianic people were not wholly wrong and stupid. I think that it was a shame that they smashed up so much, which was of worth. But some of the things, were perhaps quite good. But the book of Revelation is absolutely full of First Temple imagery, and it's worthwhile looking at it just for that. And the last thing, there's this fellow Philo, who lived in Alexandria, just on the coast down from Cairo. And Philo was a very important person in Egypt. The Jewish community had their own arrangements, and the Greek community had their own arrangements. And Philo was one of the very important people who were sent on a delegation to the Roman Emperor Caligula when he wanted to set up a statue of Olympian Zeus in the temple. And you can imagine that was an important delegation. Philo was an important person, and he wrote a very great deal of theology, and he was almost exactly contemporary of Jesus. But while Philo says a lot of things that actually do favor First Temple theology, he also he has been accused actually of being not so much a Jew as a Greek philosopher. He's read his Plato, and he's simply repeating Platonism in Jewish terms, which I think is probably absurd. I think that is much more to do with the way that theology was taught in the 19th century, both in Europe and also, I think, probably pretty well the same in the States, because what people were interested in were Greek and Latin culture. And religion, yes, religion is very important, but they didn't like meeting. On the whole, you left the theologians to be theological, and you left the classicists to be everything else. The idea that there might have been a creative involvement of Judaism and classicism, that was not a thing they found at all easy to think of. Also, I mean, Alice can perhaps guide us here, because on the whole, Greek philosophy tended to be Aristotelian. That is to say, if you speak carefully, you will actually be coherent, and what you are saying now is likely to have been the outcome of what you have spoken before. All these lovely syllogisms. You are not actually saying anything new. You are just being very carefully putting together all that you know. And you might be putting it together in a new and interesting way, but it isn't actually new. Whereas Plato, if I understand him, he was saying there is something a bit new, because if you actually use your eyes, you will find that when you look at the things of this earth, people and animals and everything else, they actually point beyond themselves. And Socrates, I think, who was Plato's teacher, as it were, before he set out as a professional philosopher, he went on a journey, and that took him to Syria, which is next door to Jerusalem. And he was visiting Syria in the time just before the Josianic reforms and the Babylonian invasion. So I've got a feeling that Plato might actually have picked up a bit of Platonism from the temple culture there, and not the other way round. But certainly Philo should be taken far more notice of. He's so contemporary to Jesus, and can't just be written off, as is often done, as a Platonist. Scholars, when I was learning 50 years ago now, heavens, tended to talk about things like the acute Hellenization of Judaism. That is, the acute taking over of Judaism by Greek philosophy. I don't think that did happen. And I think First Temple theology can be a way of bringing them together. Well, I'm afraid that is probably, if I've spoken for, yes, I have. I should have spoken for 5 minutes, and I have spoken for something like 10 minutes. But that is the wisdom of Goldsmith. So now let us look at what we have been, reading. And was there anything interesting that actually caught us by the eye, or made us surprised or angry or whatever? What we need is Pam, isn't it? Because she had read the whole book before we started looking at it.
Yeah. Yeah.
Another interesting thing then that you might be interested in, I was talking about the big golden throne in the first temple on which God sat, Yahweh, and the king. And there's a very interesting bit of mistranslation which is messing up our Old Testament, because it actually says, and when they had dedicated the temple, King David and Solomon, when they dedicated the temple, Solomon sat on this throne, and the people bowed down and worshipped Yahweh, God. They worshipped Yahweh, the king. Now, our modern translation, well, I think all our translations say something like this: and the people bowed down and they worshipped God and honored the king. That is not what it says. It says the people worshipped God the king. And Margaret turns to the book of Revelation, when the Lamb is on the throne, and it is the Lamb and something else. What else is on the throne in Revelation? This is my brain going to water again.
Along with the Lamb?
Yes.
On the throne or around the throne?
On the throne.
On the throne.
My brain isn't working. But it is interesting that, and of course, if Margaret is right in saying that they were able to speak like that, then you are on a very close to non-dualism, because we are not saying here is God and here is the king. We are actually saying here is God the king the king actually represents in himself and in a mysterious way actually is Yahweh, and the people are bowing down and worshipping. Of course, there is more to God than the king. Even a great king like David or whoever, no matter how great a king you may be, you are not going to be God in all his glory. Thank you very much. But I think that there is a oneness between God. And I would say there's a oneness between God and all of us. All created things are actually one with God, as well as being other than God. And I think this is this wonderful bit of of dualism probably has one of its earlier manifestations when they said, here's the temple, the throne of the great king is in it, Yahweh the Lord is seated there, and the king is seated there, who is actually one with Yahweh, and we worship the king as we worship Yahweh. Of course, some of the kings didn't deserve that, but this happens. But then some of the clergy didn't deserve it. I mean, it's all very well for clergy saying, we don't want these kings messing things up. We will do things better. Will we? Not so sure.
Right. So I'm wondering if this is where the origins of the divine birthright of king, of the divine birth, the idea of the divine birthright of the king came, and there was a sense of a much more profound sense of unity between Yahweh and his representative on earth. But there was a unity there, which has been disrupted or corrupted. But even when Queen Elizabeth was crowned, there was this really very mystical sense of her divine birthright as a monarch, and that her responsibility was enormous on a spiritual level, right?
Yes, they messed up all the other services, but the coronation is significantly the same to what was used for William the Conqueror in 1066. They took it seriously. Yes. Of course, they didn't develop it wisely. Elizabeth I was succeeded by James VI of Scotland, James II of England. And he took very seriously the idea that being the king was actually having a little bit of divinity in him. And he brought up his children, especially his oldest son, Charles I. And I think it was a very great shame that they didn't do it a little bit more wisely. Because if you think that you are right because God has given you the authority to be right all the time, then you are going to make big mistakes and you're not going to learn from them. I mean, dear old Liz Truss, I don't think she's a particularly religious person, but I mean, she had this clear idea, we must have a low tax economy. And she put in all sorts of measures to try to get that going. But unfortunately, it didn't work. Having a political ideology doesn't necessarily mean that you are going to be right all the time. And it turned out that she was pretty well wrong all the time. And now we've got Rishi Sunak or whatever his name is. And similarly with the kings, if they had perhaps spent a little more time looking at the evidence rather than God is with me and leading me come what may, regardless of what mess it seems to be. British English history might be slightly different from what it had been.
Well, I don't I don't know as much as you know about the British and the monarchy, etc. But look at the Catholic Church and the Pope. I mean, really and truly, I think some people, some Catholics around the world do really worship the Pope and think that everything he says comes directly from God. And so that's even more, to me, obvious. And really, it's the same thing when Jesus came. That's what the Jewish hierarchy said. Who do you think you are? Do you think you are God? You remember? I mean,
Yes.
so
yes.
it's been around forever, and I'm sure way before Jesus Christ appeared on the scene. From Neanderthal man, they put somebody up there who they thought was coming directly from whoever was making the sun go around, from east to west. So I think it's just been around as long as humans have been around, that they want to make someone divine. I just think that's in our DNA. And so we have to really be more aware and more selective, that we can think with our bigger brain that we have been given in recent times as to what's going on. But I don't think they really had the capabilities to segment out. Okay, this is.
It was all top down, wasn't it? I mean, I think in ancient of days, a lot of cultures would be quite happy with the idea that their king was actually one with God as well as being distinct from him. I think that would be quite easy. Whether they would have found it at all easy to say, well, actually, it's not only the king, it's us too. We too are one with God, at the same time as being distinct from God. It's just that we have different roles within this divine economy. And I think that certainly England up to the Cromwell and the Revolution, the king's idea of the divine right of kings was, this is something between God and the sovereign. And I don't think they would be terribly pleased with the idea of it being included in everybody's calling, that we are all called as people who are one with God, as well as being distinct from God. And this,
I think, John, there is an echo of a resonance. There must be a resonance of truth to the idea of this seed of divinity in all. And of course that gets distorted, but there is in me just a recognition. I wouldn't call myself a monarchist, but I do acknowledge and recognize the incredibly deep vow taken by the monarchist in earnest, as being representative on earth of divine right. And now that's a whole other thing when you talk about manifest destinies or this and that, where it starts to get really you can get quite distorted with these ideas. But I do think that there's a seed of truth that resonates with anybody who can acknowledge the divine within each of us. Yes, of course it gets distorted, but it is yet an ideal which can be presented through the idea of the hierarchy of a monarchy. A lot of people now have trouble with the idea of hierarchy at all. They want everything to be just sort of blasted into egalitarian sameness. I disagree with that. I believe there is hierarchy, and I do believe it's divinely ordered. And when they went in to destroy Tsar Nicholas and his family, when the Bolsheviks, when they went in to destroy during the revolution, the the family. The reason was because they embodied divine right of the monarchy ruling over the Russian people. They needed to destroy that. They had to destroy that because it was going to be the new order was not going to allow for divine birthright. It was not going to fly with them. You know what I'm saying? So I just see this tension throughout history happening, and there will always be, you know, the White Russians grieved over the loss of their royalty, and one might say that, you know, there's probably a yearning to get that back. And why? Because it feels like something is really lost. Anyway, thank you. Sorry, I didn't mean to go off.
No, it's interesting, isn't it, that as it were, leaders like Putin are very similar to the Tsars, you know, Ivan the Terrible and whoever. And we need to remember that in these days, you know, a leader like Putin probably sees himself as a servant of God, just as the old Tsars did. So I think Putin is quite happy to talk of holy Russia and all the rest. And he might be perfectly sincere, if misguided in the way he lives it out.
Of course, I wish Charlotte was here to comment, not our Russian expert. But, and I didn't mean to tread too far into that, but anyway, John, I just wanted to, you know, there's also the idea from Plato of the philosopher king.
Yeah.
That the only truly empowered leader should be someone who has somewhat of a purified nature through the study of philosophy and the study of the higher ideals, which Plato was, you know, that's what he had always developed, the idea of the ideal. And so the philosopher king would have been somebody ideally who was in a sense, what that meant was the philosopher king would be somebody incorruptible, would be somebody who was incorruptible. And I think this is what also Messiah was looked at as a leader who was incorruptible. The lamb on the throne was incorruptible. He had authority upon his shoulders, but he was pure. This is an ideal that's presented. And I think it's very real. I think it's a very real mystical reality, is all I'm trying to say. And that's, to me, why First Temple theology appeals so deeply.
Might I say just two things? The first one is totally untheological. I'm finding it difficult to hear what's going on because of these lovely bells.
Yes. Can I ask you, could you mute your mic a little bit, honey? Yeah, thank you. That's much better.
I mean, it's a lovely sound.
I know.
Really nice, but
I know, but it's definitely creating some crosstalk.
So, but you must come back, honey, when you've got something to say, and don't let us squeeze you out. So that was the first thing. I've forgotten what the second was. What were you talking about, Alison?
I was just talking about this seed of the idea of an ideal king, which is what Plato, I mean, it really intrigued me when I studied Plato's Republic, the idea of a philosopher king, and that there would be a purity there, an incorruptible nature of a truly called, someone who's truly divinely appointed. And I wouldn't say
you have to be careful.
Do you know what I'm saying?
When we're talking about incorruptibility, think of that ghastly person in the French Revolution, Robespierre, sea green incorruptible. Oh yes, no. And the reason I say that is that when I did a certain amount of Plato in classics at school, and then when we were doing theology, one of our set books in philosophy was the Republic. And I suddenly thought there is something wrong here, because I think most people would say the Plato is looking at the two educational systems, Athens and Sparta. Athens was be very flexible, just follow the truth where it takes you. Sparta says, this is the way you are going or else. And Plato clearly was fairly drawn to both. And I said, but we need to learn from this, because Plato loved the philosopher king, but he cut away an awful lot of life from the people in his vision. For example, all poetry was actually condemned. And Plato and Sparta, they were at war with Athens for an awful long time, and Sparta won. Now, Sparta could have actually led the way. In fact, Athens continued to lead the way, because the Spartan way just did not work. It's all very well having the best army in the world, but when you have won the battle, what do you do with it? I mean, things are different now, partly because the world is much smaller, and partly because all sorts of technology can be invoked by the military for the good of people, as well as for killing them. But in those days, if you're a Spartan soldier, you were a very good soldier, but nothing else.
Mhm.
That was left to the slaves and the helots, the sort of semi-slaves. And that was so, and a hundred years later, they'd virtually disappeared, not because anybody had beaten them, but because there wasn't anything worthwhile for them to do. And so they just faded away.
Mhm.
Now, that was, so I would say, when listening to Plato for philosophical advice, watch out.
Oh, I know. And because also Plato was an advocate of absolute censorship. So and that was because, the reason he gave was that anybody who was a good teacher, anybody who was going to truly teach in a culture would have to censor information to help direct them wisely towards truth, because there would be so many things that you'd have to filter out. And of course, we can see the danger of that, and we understand the danger of that right there. But I also understand what he's saying, that there's an awful lot of filtering out of things that we need to, in other words, impurities that we would need to filter out of our field in order to go. And this is the Spartan impulse, of course, also is to train the mind, to discipline the constitution, to be able to move forward and progress. There is an implication that there is a progression there. And so that can be, of course, that can become automatically tyrannical, dictatorial, censorial, and therefore in the wrong hands, corruptible, and therefore throw that out the window. But I do remember when I first read about Plato's idea on censorship, I understood what he was saying. It was not to censor out through tyranny, but it was to censor out through wise guidance.
Yes.
Just as an example, of what the philosopher king may have presided over in a culture.
Yes, the trouble is that Goldsmith's idea of wise governance may be absolutely the other thing to other people. I mean, the reason why it was really good that the American Revolution succeeded was simply, in my view, of the distances. The Royal Navy was the best in the world at that time. Yes, it was. But it couldn't bridge the gap between the Atlantic and the rest of the North American landmass. It just, you know, you needed two bases, and it was very sensible that you had yours. So it wasn't a battle between, on the one hand, the divine right of kings, and on the other, no taxation without representation.
Right, right, right.
Well, that's my understanding. I mustn't tell you.
I have a request. Can we talk about unity, like day one on page 24?
Yeah, that is really next week, isn't it? Creation.
That's next week, because we technically are still supposed to just stay within the parameters of the introduction right now.
Okay.
I've read ahead too, but I think in the interest of keeping us all on the same page, I don't know if we really want to jump there yet.
Okay. I just thought that was this time. Sorry.
Yeah, no, it was decided last time that John would keep going on the introduction, because we did not want to hastily throw ourselves forward into this without having a very strong background. And I'm glad, because I think he really clarified a lot, talking about the Second Temple and you know, the Enoch and all those things, the patriarchal religion. I think we needed that background. I think it's been very, very helpful. And John, do you think you finished your summary there?
I think I have, yes.
Because we don't need to go much longer. I really think it would be more fruitful for us to wrap this up and move on, and because you see, there's honey chomping at the bit to get on to chapter 2.
Yes.
So I think what should we haven't decided formally, but I guess just working with the next chapter, chapter 1. If you want to read forward, by all means, but the conversation, I think next week should, or 2 weeks hence, should concentrate on the first chapter, creation.
Yeah.
There's plenty in there. There's a lot in there to talk about, and unity is part of that. So creation goes up to page 32. Okay.
And I've made a note of unity and honey.
Good. Yeah. So we need to all get on the same page with that. So
Lovely.
Same chapter. So let's I'm going to stop the recording now, if that's okay with you.
Yep.
I think we've gotten the essence of what we need to get done today. Unless anybody has anything to add. So see you next time.
Thank you.